Good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen. Kemenq Learning Week Day 2 is about to begin. But before we get started, let me take a moment to review a few technical details. As yesterday's webinar, today's webinar will also be conducted in English. It comes with a caption in the Zoom application. To view the caption, click on the CC icon and then choose English or Indonesian language. This webinar is also available on our YouTube channel, BPPK Kemenq RI. That's all the information. Let us now begin Kemenq Learning Week Day 2, Fiscal Sustainability. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome back to Kemenq Learning Week Day 2, Fiscal Sustainability. Now, allow me to briefly highlight the purpose of today's session. Fiscal sustainability is about maintaining sound and stable public finances so that the government can continue delivering essential services, investing in long-term development, and responding effectively to economic shocks and uncertainties. With that in mind, it is my great pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished guests, the head of the Regional Office of Directorate General of Treasury for West Papua Province, Bapak Moh Abdul Kobir, and of course our special guest speaker, Mawish Ashraf from the World Bank. I am Irma from the Ministry of Finance, honored to be the host at this event. Today is the second day of the Kemenq Learning Week 2026. We would like to welcome you to this webinar series across 4 days. I'll just draw your attention to the agenda. We'll talk about fiscal sustainability as we reflect on today's fiscal challenges and strengthen the institutional capacities required for long-term resilience. Best regards to all participants who have joined us today. And I am delighted to share that hundreds of participants are currently joining us via Zoom and YouTube. Dear participants, to officially open this webinar, we are pleased to have the opportunity to hear the keynote speech by Head of the Regional Office of the Directorate General of Treasury for West Papua Province, Bapak Moh Abdul Kobir. Good morning, Pak Kobir. How are you today?
Good morning, Irma. I'm fine, thank you. And you?
I'm very well. All the team is here.
Okay.
So we're very glad to have you here today. We are so delighted. So without further ado, should we just start the keynote speech, please?
Okay.
Okay.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. Good afternoon, esteemed leaders and colleagues. First and foremost, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude and a warm welcome to Mawish Ashraf, Senior Economist, the World Bank. We are honored to have her join us as a distinguished speaker for today's webinar on the theme of ensuring fiscal sustainability for long-term development. I also extend a warm welcome to our participants in today's sessions. The theme we explore today is how to finance development priorities without jeopardizing long-term fiscal health. This discourse is imperative to shaping Indonesia's resilience and future prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, we stand at critical moment in a global fiscal history. According to the International Monetary Fund's October 2025 fiscal monitor, global public debt is projected to surpass 100% of GDP by 2029. This number is a reality that demands urgent attention and coordinated action. Indonesia's fiscal position, while stronger than many advanced economies, faces its own set of challenges that require careful navigation. As of June 2025, Indonesia's central government debt stood at 9 trillion rupiah, equivalent to 39% of GDP, well below the legal limit of 60% and well below levels seen in many OECD countries. Meanwhile, the fiscal deficit for 2025 reached 2.92% of GDP, approaching the constitutional ceiling of 3%. Although this deficit remains within the government's prudent design for 2025, total tax revenue collection as of December 2025 reached 89% of the full year budget. Target, reflecting weaker than anticipated revenue performance amid slowing economic activity. These figures remind us that revenue performance matters deeply for financing development programs and for safeguarding fiscal space. Distinguished participants, fiscal sustainability in Indonesia can be viewed through four key pillars: sufficient and fair revenue, efficient and effective spending, well-managed deficit and debt, and capacity to respond to shocks. First, sufficient and fair revenue. Tax reform and digitalization of tax administration are central to maintaining a healthy revenue to GDP ratio without overburdening the most vulnerable. Efforts to broaden the tax base, reduce leakages, and improve compliance through better data and technology reinforce public trust, particularly when citizens see the tax system operating fairly and supporting shared development outcomes. Second, efficient and effective public spending. Under the PAN program, hundreds of trillions of rupiah were directed to health, social assistance, and support for MSMEs with an increasing focus on targeting, transparency, and impact. The shift is from big spending to high impact spending, where evaluation, monitoring, and learning are embedded in the policy cycle. Third, well-managed deficit and debt. During the pandemic, the fiscal deficit widened significantly, but within a time-bound and clearly communicated framework with a commitment to return to the statutory deficit ceiling after the crisis period. This approach allowed Indonesia to deploy a strong counter-cyclical fiscal policy while maintaining investor confidence and macroeconomic stability. Fourth, resilience to shocks. Indonesia's ability to mobilize around 695 trillion rupiah for PAN without triggering a crisis of confidence shows that our country had built sufficient fiscal buffers and credibility beforehand. Looking ahead, the shocks will not only come from pandemics, but also from more frequent natural disasters, commodity price volatility, and the green transition. Fiscal policy must remain flexible and forward-looking to absorb these shocks. Distinguished guests, fiscal sustainability is ultimately about intergenerational equity. The decisions we make today, what we spend, how we tax, How much we borrow determine the opportunities available to our children and grandchildren. Will they inherit an economy burdened by debt service that crowds out investments in the future? Or will they inherit fiscal space to address the challenges of their time? The US Treasury analysis is instructive, delaying fiscal consolidation from 2025 to 2035 increases the required adjustment by 0.8 percentage points of GDP. Waiting until 2045 increases it by 2 percentage points. Every year of inaction makes the eventual adjustment more painful and places a heavier burden on future generations. Indonesia has the opportunity to chart a different course. By acting now, while debt levels remain moderate, while growth remains resilient, while institutions maintain credibility, the country can secure fiscal sustainability without sacrificing development ambitions. This requires courage. It requires technical expertise. It requires political leadership willing to make difficult choices and explain them honestly. And it requires all of us, as policymakers, public servants, civil society, private sector, and citizens to engage constructively in the difficult conversation about priorities, trade-offs, and shared sacrifice. Ladies and gentlemen, on this special day, we have the honor to have Mehwish Ashraf from the World Bank share with us insight on how government can design and sustain fiscal policies that support long-term development while preserving fiscal space. Through this seminar, participants can expect to gain a deeper understanding of the key elements of fiscal sustainability, practical perspective drawn from country experiences, and tools to assess development programs through both fiscal and economic lenses. I encourage all participants to engage actively in today's discussions, reflect critically on the ideas shared, and consider how these insights can be applied on your own work, both in strengthening current initiatives and shaping more sustainable policies going forward. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion ahead. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Santi Santi Om. Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Pak Abdul Qadir.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Pak Abdul Qadir, for those insightful opening words. We would love to have you till the end of the webinar. However, we understand that you may have other commitments. So please feel free to leave the webinar at your convenience.
Thank you very much. I would like to leave.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sia.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, now it's time for the main event that we have been waiting for. But before we get started, I'd like to make a housekeeping announcement for our audience. The talk will go on for around 45 minutes, followed by 20 minutes of Q&A session. Please keep your camera on and your microphones on mute to keep disruptions to a minimum. If you're joining us via Zoom, you can either click on the raise hand button and I will call your name, or write down your questions in the chat box, which I will read them as well. And if you're joining us through live streaming on YouTube, please write down your questions into the live chat. Also, do not forget to join the course in Kemenq Learning Center. Complete the feedback form available in the course to get a certificate. Dear participants, now let's get started and give a warm welcome to our distinguished speaker, Mehwish Ashraf, who will deliver her talk, Ensuring Fiscal Sustainability for Long-Term Development, Indonesia's Policy Challenge. Allow me to briefly read her profile first. Mawis Ashraf is the senior economist based in Jakarta and leads the fiscal policy analysis and dialogue with the authorities. Mawis, a Pakistani national, joined the bank in 2011, where she has held different roles across South Asia, Africa, and Pacific, including economist for Pakistan based in Islamabad, economist for Gambia based in Banjul, and senior economist for Fiji and Tuvalu based in Suva. Prior to joining the bank, Mawis also worked at the Public Debt Office at the Pakistan Ministry of Finance. She holds an MBA in finance from Quaid-i-Azam University in Islamabad. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me and give her a warm welcome to Mawis Ashraf. Good morning, Mawis. How are you today?
Selamat pagi, assalamualaikum, and good morning, Irma.
Waalaikumsalam.
Thank you for having me here.
Can you speak in bahasa Indonesia? I just wondering.
I'm trying to learn a little bit. I'm doing Bahasa classes, but yeah, it's a language that I'd like and I'd like to learn.
Oh my God, we're so happy to have you here. How's Jakarta so far?
Very nice.
Very nice.
You guys are very welcoming. Yeah. It's very nice.
I hope you enjoy Jakarta as well.
Yeah,
okay.
We are.
Okay, Mawis. All right, without further ado, allow me to present you to our speaker, Mawis Ashraf. I hope I'm not mispronounce your name. The screen is yours, Mawis.
Thank you, Irma. Terima kasih. Let me share my screen. I hope you can see my screen and the presentation. Thank you once again, Irma, for having me here. Assalamualaikum once again, good morning, selamat pagi, and terima kasih for inviting me. Today, I will be talking about fiscal sustainability. Now, that phrase can be quite technical, but and in some cases, it could even be intimidating. But at its heart, it's actually a very practical question. It's really about this. How can governments or a country keep paying for its development goals year after year without running into trouble when the next crisis hits? I'll start with some simple ideas that work and apply everywhere, and then I'll gradually bring in Indonesia experience to show how those ideas work in the real world. And I would like to acknowledge Pa Abdul Khair, who had made my job easy because he kind of listed a lot of things that I'm going to talk about. So it's basically just please consider my talk as an extension of the points, the headline points that he made in his opening remarks. And as I mentioned, let's begin with principles first. Fiscal policy is often reduced to a few numbers. You hear about deficits, you hear about debts, you hear about ratios, but that misses the bigger picture. Fiscal policy is really a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. At its core, it's trying to do a few big things. It provides public services like roads, hospitals, and schools. It protects people from risks they can't manage on their own, and it stabilizes the economy when things get bumpy. Also, it supports long-term growth and resilience. One way to think about is this. Fiscal policy is not a single instrument, it's a multi-purpose tool. And if we judge it by using just one indicator, we are basically missing most of the story. So that's an important point to draw and keep in mind. Now, we're talking about fiscal sustainability. So what do we mean by it? And I'd like to bring in an analogy here. Think about a household with a mortgage. Sustainability doesn't mean that you never borrow. It basically means that you are able to pay your bills today, and you can not and you're basically not lying in the night awake thinking about the future. When you kind of extend this analogy to governments, fiscal sustainability means being able to meet current and future obligations without sudden disruptive changes. For instance, a rate hike or some kind of emergency spending cuts, while still supporting growth and social goals. And it's important to be clear what fiscal sustainability is not uh, about. It's not about zero deficits. It's not about paying down all your debt at all costs. And it's not something you judge based on 1 year's numbers. It's kind of a long term dynamic concept. Now, let's bring all of this together into a development context. And I'm bringing in Indonesia here. Indonesia has ambitious and very reasonable goals: faster growth, better infrastructure, stronger human capital, and greater resilience to climate and disaster risks. Of all these goals, the key thing that I'd like you to remember is that these goals are not one off expenses, they are commitments that stretch over decades. You can think of it like building a house. The real cost just isn't about construction. It's maintenance, repairs, upgrades, and utilities over time. This is where fiscal sustainability becomes very concrete. If public finances aren't sustainable, governments can crowd out private investment, borrowing becomes more expensive, and when shocks hit, there's little room to respond. I'd like to think of fiscal space. Now I'm switching from fiscal sustainability to fiscal space. I'd like to think of the concept of fiscal space as an airbag. You really hope you never need it. But when there is a crash, you really want it to work. Now, how do you finance development? Let's talk about the first pillar of financing development: domestic revenue. Domestic revenue is the most reliable way to finance development. Unlike commodity prices or capital flows, it doesn't disappear overnight. It also builds accountability. When citizens contribute, they expect results, and over time, that trends to strengthen and improve governance. And one very common way to raise domestic revenues is taxes. And let me be very candid. Taxes often get a bad reputation. But from an economic perspective, they're actually a very flexible policy tool. They finance public services, help redistribute income, and correct market failures. Let me give you an example here. Tobacco taxes aren't just about raising revenues, they are designed to discourage unhealthy behavior. So you can think of them as speed bumps where society wants people to slow down, right? So it's basically trying to kind of achieve a number of objectives. Now, this chart on the right-hand side that you see on this slide is a precursor to the next slide, and it shows that there is a tax threshold around 15% of GDP, where future inclusive growth, which is the chart B here, improves significantly. And building on this chart and this analytics that we have done at the World Bank, you'll also often hear that this idea that country needs at least 15% of GDP in tax revenues. Now, it's not a magic number. It's even not a policy target. It's more of a reality check because below this level, and countries usually struggle to fund basic services without relying heavily on borrowing or cutting back sharply when shocks occur. Now, please allow me to spend a few minutes on tax design because I believe this is where a lot of misunderstanding creeps in and where good policy can quietly bring major differences and make a big difference. When economists talk about tax design, we are really asking a very practical question. How can governments raise the revenue they need while doing the least possible harm to the economy and while being fair? So that's basically the question that kind of underpins the tax design. And there are 4 ideas that are especially useful here. First is the marginal effectiveness of public funds. Now that sounds very technical term, but its intuition is simple. It's basically asking if the government raises 1 rupiah, additional rupiah in taxes, how much value does society get in return? So, in a country with high revenue, the next rupiah might fund something marginal. But in a country, in a low revenue country where revenues are already low and public resources are scarce, that same rupiah might fund a classroom, a clinic, or a road. So the social payoff can be very high. This is why raising revenue can be strongly growth enhancing if the money is well spent. So there is a very clear link between raising revenues, and how you spend that money that you have raised through those revenues. The second concept is economic efficiency, which is often discussed in terms of deadweight loss. Let me try to explain this concept using another analogy. I'm thinking of a leaky bucket here. Some taxes raise revenue but also distort behavior. For instance, people would not want to work, they would invest less, or they would move into informality. The more the bucket leaks, the more value is lost along the way. Good tax design tries to raise revenues with the smallest possible leak. That usually means broader bases, lower rates, and fewer special exemptions. And that is what it means having an economically efficient tax system. The third thing is tax incidence. And this reminds us very clearly that who pays a tax on paper is not necessarily always the one who bears the tax burden in reality. A corporate tax, for instance, might fall disproportionately on workers through lower wages or on consumers through higher prices. So you can already see that the tax burden shifts when we think about who is basically bearing the brunt. And that's why it's important to understand incidence because it matters for fairness, for equity. It helps policymakers avoid unintended distributional consequences, especially in societies with inequality concerns. And finally, the last concept, the fourth concept, is about administrative and compliance cost. Think about a text that looks perfect in theory, in textbook, but it's impossible to administer well. And that probably is not a good tax. Complex systems increase costs for governments, taxpayers, and they often encourage invasion. So that is why simple rules, clear definitions, and strong administration are just as important as tax rates and tax bases. Now, putting all this together, good tax design isn't just about maximizing revenue at any cost. It's about actually maximizing the social value of every rupiah raised, especially in countries where public resources are scarce. And that's why these concepts matter so much in practice, not just in textbooks. And when you try to apply these concepts first globally, the experience has suggested that broadening tax bases, improving administration, and removing or reducing exemptions often deliver more than frequent rate changes. Let me give you an example of Mexico. Mexico experience shows how improvements in tax administration and digitalization, something that Pa Kobir also mentioned in his opening remarks, it can raise revenues without major tax rate increases. Another example that comes to mind is Vietnam, where there was a gradual base broadening alongside growth, and that sustainably financed development in the country. And we believe these lessons are highly relevant for Indonesia. Now, let me turn to the second pillar of financing development. So far, we were talking about the first very important key pillar, which was domestic revenues. Now we are turning to the second pillar, which is debt. Now, when you think of debt, there's almost always somewhere someone is saying there's a problem. It's basically treated as a problem, but borrowing itself isn't the issue. Here's the key thing and key idea. If the value created by public spending exceeds the cost of financing it, borrowing actually accelerates development. Let me also give you an analogy here once again. Think of debt as student loans. They make sense if they raise lifetime income. They don't if they fund your day to day consumption without returns. In either case, it's still considered a debt, but it's basically the use of that financing or that loan or that debt which matters. And that brings us to the point of quality. And when you think about quality, investment spending is often emphasized, and because it's easier to appraise and monitor. And what really matters in using borrowing or for spending purposes or to finance some of the expenditure priorities is basically value for money. The labels, they don't matter that much. The results matter at the end of the day. And I want to give you a statistic here. Based on our data and what we have seen in emerging markets and advanced economies, almost 25 to 40% of GDP is public spending. And most of the public spending is going on infrastructure, education, health, and social spending. So you can already draw parallel of where Indonesia is and where the emerging markets and advanced economies are already in this sphere. Now, coming to debt management, let's talk about the some of the global examples. I can think of Thailand. Thailand has a very conservative debt strategy. It has long maturities, and its debt is mostly in domestic currency, and that has allowed it to absorb shocks with limited stress. On the other hand, when we think of Brazil, it illustrates the opposite risk. It shows that how even a moderate debt level can become destabilizing when fiscal frameworks show signs of weakening credibility and refinancing risks rise. When the if you can see the chart here, the Brazil's debt has kind of climbed to almost around 70s as a share of GDP. We've also seen that fiscal rules have been strained by rising mandatory expenditures, and refinancing risk has also increased in part because a greater share of Brazil's debt is short term in nature or rate sensitive. And as a result, credit agencies have started responding by tempering positive outlooks, underscoring the link between fiscal credibility and market perceptions. Building or drawing on these examples, two different examples from different regions, one within our own region here in Southeast Asia, but also one from the LAC, we see that Indonesia's debt levels are moderate, maturities are relatively long, and much of the debt is in local currency, and that structure matters a lot for resilience, something that Abdul Kobir also mentioned, which is very important in the case of Indonesia, and especially during shocks. Now, when we talk about shocks, why are we emphasizing on shocks? Because shocks are no longer rare events. We all saw what happened in Sumatra late last year in Indonesia. They're part of the baseline now. The economists need to start thinking about putting these shocks as not rare events, but more of a general or a regular or a frequent kind of event that needs to be incorporated in the baselines of our macro framework. And when you think about buffers, think about it like of it like saving accounts. You don't build them during a crisis. You rely on them during that shock period, right? So buffers kind of play that role. Let me bring Peru's example. We have seen that its experience over the past decades have shown that how strong fiscal buffers that the country was able to build during the commodity boom of early 2000s and also after the global financial crisis of 2008. That has helped Peru to really build on that credibility, on the precautionary balances, on those fiscal buffers to respond more forcefully and decisively during shocks, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so similarly, we see Indonesia's pandemic response also benefited from fiscal space at that time, and that highlights the value of rebuilding buffers over time, which is very important, especially in the case of Indonesia. Now, let us now turn to the third pillar of the whole fiscal sustainability kind of debate and discussion. And here I'd like to change gears and talk a little bit more about the institutional side of fiscal policy. And as soon as you think about institutions and fiscal policy, you think about fiscal rules. And it's also important because Indonesia also has fiscal rules. So I thought we should also talk about it and think about it from a fiscal policy or a fiscal sustainability perspective. Now, what are fiscal rules and why do they exist? Fiscal rules exist because even well-intentioned governments face pressure to spend in and overspend in good times. And think of fiscal rules as commitment devices. Like when you go shopping, it's always prudent to set a budget before you go shopping. So think about it that way. And think about it not as substitute for sound policy judgment, but they are more like a complement to those policy judgments and policy work. In UK, for instance, we have Office of Budget Responsibility, and in Sweden, we have a Fiscal Policy Council. So these kinds of independent fiscal institutions, they enhance the credibility of fiscal rules, and they do not make policy decisions, but they reduce optimism bias. For instance, they improve the public understanding of fiscal risks, and they lend credibility to the fiscal rules, the institution of fiscal rules in those countries. And there could be a number of fiscal rules, and the different rules solve different problems. Some focus on deficits, some on debt, others on spending, and many countries combine them depending on their objectives and institutional capacity. No single rule fits all contexts. So it's very important to think about the rule setting in the context of a specific country. Let me now focus a little bit more on one specific type of fiscal rule, which is also very relevant for Indonesia, which is the fiscal balance rules. These are the rules that limit deficits either in headline terms or in adjusted terms. Uh, at a very basic level, these rules are about credibility, which is a very important term used when it comes to fiscal policy in a country. And so it kind of trickles down to all the concepts that we talk about in fiscal policy and fiscal sustainability. These rules, they help answer a simple question that citizens, investors, and markets often ask. They the question is, can the government be trusted to keep its finances under control over time, not just today, not just tomorrow, but over the medium to long term? And that's where there is an important point that I'd like to make. Please do not confuse credibility with rigidity. The credibility doesn't have to come from rigidity, in other words. A rule that ignores the economic cycle, the business cycle of economy, or major shocks may look tough on paper, but it often breaks down in practice. So when that happens, credibility is actually weakened, as I just mentioned. The weakening of credibility for Brazil in slightly different context, and that is why it's important that and in this emerging kind of work on fiscal balance rules and these kinds of institutions, countries have eventually moved towards more flexible balance rules. Instead of targeting the raw headline deficit every year, they adjust for the economic cycle or the business cycle of the economy, and they allow for clearly defined exceptional events. Now, I know that this is becoming a bit technical and we have a varied audience here today listening to us. So let me try to bring in an example that you can relate to. Think about these fiscal rules as a thermostat. You don't set your heating to one fixed temperature regardless of the weather outside, right? You adjust, but you can adjust within the limits. So think about these fiscal rules as doing the same thing when they are within the limits. And basically they're within limits to kind of limit your fiscal balance. And because we're talking about fiscal balance right now, fiscal balance rules. So I'm kind of drawing that or connecting that analogy to those fiscal balance rules. Another fiscal balance rule that some countries have used in the past, and they have also advanced to a slightly different concept, is called a golden rule. You may have heard about it. The idea is very interesting. It's basically saying that whatever you borrow, a government borrow, it only borrows for a spending that would benefit your future generation. so like infrastructure or human capital, because those are long-term in nature. But it's that borrowing, the borrowing that would happen is not for day-to-day consumption. And what's the logic behind that? The logic is on intergenerational equity or fairness. And then you also think about it from a longer term perspective, because if the future generations will benefit from the decisions of today, from the spending commitments of today, it's reasonable that they also share some of the cost, because the long term borrowing will come due during that their time, for instance, and they will have to pay for it. When you think of some global examples of this golden rule, I can think of Germany, UK, Switzerland, that have uh, instituted some form of golden rules. But they also, as I mentioned earlier, they have also transitioned towards a structural balance rule. And why is that so? Because the golden rule is very difficult in terms of implementation from a misuse perspective, from a measurement of what is constitutes investment and what does not. And also it requires a lot of political discipline. So even those advanced economies have moved from the golden rule kind of a debate to a bit more of a flexible structured balance rules. But however, there are some subnationals across the globe, like U.S. Municipalities and states, some Nordic local governments that still employ golden rules, and the golden rule has successfully worked in those subnational contexts. Primarily because there is a very clear investment definition in those counties, in those subnationals, the budget constraints are hard in nature, and there is a limited ability to roll over debt indefinitely for those subnationals. So those kinds of constraints have helped those golden rules to work successfully in the subnational context, but not that much on the national. Over time, it starts getting abused, the misuse happens, and the measurement and all those issues that we discussed earlier. But let me also say that all of these rules do not work automatically. What really gives fiscal balance rules credibility are three things: clear legal foundations, transparency about when and why deviations occur, and critically, a credible path back to the rule. When these three elements are in place, balance rules do not constrain good policy. So please do not think of these balance rules or these fiscal rules as constraining good policy. In fact, they protect it. They anchor expectations. They preserve fiscal space. And so it's important to think about these balance rules as more of creating buffers, as more of preserving fiscal space, as more of kind of giving a sense to your markets, to your investors, to your citizens, that we are credibly proceeding within the envelopes that we have. And the real test of these balance rules is not whether they are ever bent. It's fine to be bent, but it's important to think about whether they are bent deliberately, temporarily, and credibly. Those are important aspects to keep in mind and to bear in mind. And for this on this point, let me share our Indonesia's experience, which we feel is a very good illustration of this. During COVID-19 pandemic, the deficit rule that Indonesia had, it was temporarily suspended through legislation, which is good practice. The deviation was clearly time bound, another good practice, and the framework was restored once the crisis passed, which is also very good practice. So and out of all these aspects, what mattered wasn't the deviation itself. It was that the deviation was legal, temporary, and credibly reversed, the three aspects that I mentioned in my previous slide. So we feel that Indonesia is a very good example of how you can basically practically follow these fiscal rules and still stay credible within your investors and markets and citizens and the broader world. I can also give you some examples from the global experiences. One example that comes to mind is basically Chile. Chile experience, because it's also a commodity exporter like Indonesia, during 2010s, they targeted a structural balance rather than the headline deficit, and they avoided pro-cyclical spending, spending that goes up when economy goes up, and spending that goes down when economy goes down. They avoided that kind of spending, especially during booms. And booms is the one that goes up and the spending goes up. And then they preserved buffers for downturns, for the bust cycle. And that's how they kind of insulated themselves from all the things, the shocks that could happen and that could derail their fiscal trajectory. Another example that I can think of is Germany, which shows very strong legal anchors that exist with the flexibility through clearly defined escape clauses. As when a shock of a specific magnitude happens, Germany can go to the legislation and they can ask for some kind of flexibility within the fiscal rules. So those aspects are very important, and when you're thinking about fiscal rules. Um, Now, if I so far what we have discussed is basically we have discussed what fiscal policy itself is, what is fiscal sustainability, and we have tried to kind of break down the concept of fiscal sustainability from the lens of financing development, which is an important aspect of Indonesia's fiscal story and economic story. And within financing development, or within the ambit of how to finance sustainably, we have thought about and we've talked about taxes, domestic revenue primarily, and borrowing, prudent borrowing. And then we have also thought about how to make it all together, so that it doesn't fall off the cliff, or it doesn't fall outside of the hands of policymakers and get us all into trouble. And we talked about the institutions of fiscal policies, primarily fiscal rules, which are very relevant for Indonesia. So please allow me to put it all together towards the end now. And I want to step back a little bit now that I'm kind of finishing my talk here. And I would like to talk about these three pillars that I've kind of walked you through the presentation. And it's important to think about these three pillars as revenues, strong and reliable, quality spending, high quality spending, and prudent borrowing. So, borrowing is not just for day to day consumption, but for high quality spending, which is an important aspect. And institutions, fiscal rules that anchor expectations, but also allow flexibility. Let me also say that there is no single formula, but these principles have shown up again and again across countries, and these are good principles to follow. Let me now talk about some of the key takeaways from this session for you. Uh, Global experiences, and what I have also kind of alluded to during my presentation, they reinforce one point. They reinforce that fiscal sustainability is not about a single policy lever. It's the result of credible rules, strong institutions, prudent debt management, and transparency. So it's very important to think about it as a whole integrated piece of these specific elements. And we also, I'd also like to mention here that we see Indonesia's framework already reflecting most of these principles. It needs to continue sustaining the fiscal discipline, while financing ambitious development and managing increasingly complex shocks. If there is one thing that I'd like you to take away from this session, it's this, in a very layman's language. Fiscal sustainability is not just about austerity or accounting. It's about preserving choices for the future. Thank you very much, Terima kasih, and I look forward to your questions.
For your insightful talk. You reminded us that fiscal sustainability it's not about chasing a single number, but about ensuring that public finances can support development goals today and in the future without sacrificing credibility or flexibility. And we also love your thermostat analogy. From revenue mobilization to tax design and fiscal space, the message is really clear. Principles matters and institutions matter just as much as policy choices. Now we will go on to the Q&A session. I bet the audience is very eager to hear more from you. If you would like to engage with Mawish, please raise your hand, introduce yourself briefly, and keep your question concise so we can accommodate several participants. Okay, do we have any? Okay, we got one participant who has raised her hand. I'd like to call you upon Ibu Lili Mutiari.
Hi, Mbak Ima. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And hi, Mahwish. I'm Lily from Financial Education and Training Agency. I'd like to ask, I'm very interested with the topic of fiscal sustainability, and Indonesia has been having the 3% limit for years, even though we had a short pause a bit during the pandemic. I wonder if there has been any study regarding this limit, since we know that a lot of developed economy, I'm not trying to say Indonesia is developed, but has a 100%, more than 100% deficit. And but by the like the sense of the citizen itself, we already seeing 3% as probably too much. Like people are worried about having too much debt. But is there any sort of close to ideal number of percentage for this deficit for Indonesia specifically? Thank you.
Okay, Mahwish, would you like to answer directly or should we collect all of other questions?
It would be good to collect a couple of questions, Irma, and then I can respond to them collectively.
Okay. If we got another participants who would like to ask questions directly to Mahwish from our Zoom. Any other one? Or should we? Oh, okay. We got other participants here. Bapak Aristito. Okay, Bapak
Yes,
Aristito, you can ask your questions briefly.
thank you.
And
Thank you so much,
introduce
Irma.
yourself. Yeah.
Yes, my name is Tito. I'm from BPPK, Financial Education Training Agency. I really like your presentation, Mavis. I really enjoy it, really. You mentioned about the tax is considered the best source of financing for development. And for Indonesia, I think that's accurate, since tax is the largest contributor to our national budget. But my question is, what are probably the second best sources for funding that we might not have been fully tapped yet in Indonesia, maybe from other countries that we can learn to? That's all, I think. Thank you so much.
Okay, we've got two participants who ask questions. Is it okay to start to answer the questions, please, Maurice?
Sure. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you, Irma. So great questions. And thank you so much for listening very, very closely and staying engaged, because the questions speak of the depth of how much you learned, and I'm very happy to see that. So let me first take the first question on the fiscal deficit. So these numbers, and if I got the history of Indonesia right, when these numbers were being set up, Europe was basically your main benchmark. You were basically looking to them, and that's how you picked up the number. If you and we have done at the World Bank, we have done some work for authorities on fiscal rules last year, and there was some good knowledge sharing based on other countries' experiences as well with Indonesia. First, let me try to give you a sense of how we see Indonesia. We see Indonesia in a relative position of strength. You have a very long, good track record of macroeconomic stability, including fiscal stability. You have earned credibility of the markets, primarily because you have stayed within your limits. And even if you feel that your debt to GDP ratio is high, it's not high relative to other countries. And you are much below, you have a lot of debt headroom if, in respect to your own debt limits, which is 60% of GDP. You are around 40% of GDP. Not to say or not to give that impression that you have a lot of space, so please go and start borrowing tomorrow. Of course, prudent borrowing is very important, but there's no one magic number around these limits. They're largely set up as per the country's context, in line with how you feel you can basically put your boundaries or your limits together. In terms of when we look at the 3% deficit, we do not see a problem with the deficit balance or the balance rule. And we do not think that there is a need for the government to change, even though if they want to change to, for instance, 4%, it won't make much of a difference. The main aspect or the main things to look at is basically domestic revenue mobilization, which is very low for a country like Indonesia. You have seen one of the charts that I also presented in the slide deck. If there are countries which have gone through these kinds of 3% rule, like when I was talking about the 25 to 40% of GDP public spending in my slide during my speech, that means that if they are, for instance, having a 3% deficit rule, they must be earning around 28% to 43% of revenues, right? That's how they are kind of spending 25% to 40%. So I don't think this kind of a net number matters that much. It's more about the levels of both the revenue and the spending that matters a lot. And in Indonesia's context, it's important to have that kind of a high double digit kind of a revenue mobilization number so that you can spend on all your needs for future, for today and for future in terms of your ambitions and development goals. So that is how we would say it. Just to kind of simply answer, there is no one ideal number to put through these limits, but it's all depends on context. It depends on the country circumstances, and it's more important to think about these limits as boundaries rather than the starting point. The starting point could be that you could probably be raising 30% of GDP in revenues, and so you could probably spend 33% of GDP in spending, which will be a lot, and which will probably cover for all your public financing needs in terms of realizing your goals. So that's the kind of answer that I'd like to give for the first question. On the second question, Patito, thank you so much, I'm glad you asked that. And if you could probably think about the one of the slides where I kind of plotted Indonesia with other countries, and I'm plotting it with upper middle income countries because Indonesia is an upper middle income country, and I'm plotting it with high income countries because Indonesia wants to become a high income country. And if you would see in those two country groups, the tax revenue are the biggest contributor of domestic revenue mobilization. Other sources of financing or other sources of domestic revenue mobilization are very limited. Tax is probably the most important. In a country like Indonesia, which has a very strong commodity base, you could think about non-tax revenues also, but there are a number of trade-offs that need to be looked into. Environmental sustainability from that perspective. Also, non-tax revenue, these are natural resources, so these could deplete as well over time. So there is this sustainability aspect to it. And so it's important to think about your domestic revenue mobilization largely from a taxation perspective. And it's not to say that the government has to tax each and every one. So with the four principles that I discussed in terms of designing your tax policy are very important to think about how the tax or the revenue mobilization can be done fairly, can be done in a way without harming the economy, and making sure that you have enough resources to fund your development needs, which have to be funded through public funding, not from private side. So that's an important consideration to look into. But taxes by far remain the most important source of revenue generation for the government. Of course, the second important and the second most important when it comes to the overall fiscal sustainability is debt. But then also debt is very closely linked with the spending and the quality of spending. What kind of spending you are going to do with the debt that you have just raised or with the loan that you have just gotten? Is it to basically cover for your day-to-day expenses, or is it to cover for some kind of a house construction, for instance, which is much more of a long-term asset creation? So that's how I'd like to say. It's probably Texas. Texas is the answer. Let me stop here, and I'm happy to take more questions.
Okay, thank you, Mawis. Maybe we can ask our previous respondent first. Pak Aristito, are there any following up questions, or Ibu Lili? Okay.
That's all for me. Thank you so much for your response, Mawis.
Okay, thank you. Probably we can move on to our next participant who will ask question on our Zoom. I'd like to call you upon Johanna. Please tell us your name and your institution, and then ask your questions.
Thank you for the opportunity, Ms. Irma, and good morning, Madam Awish. It is my honor to hear your perspective on fiscal sustainability. I would like to hear your opinion regarding energy transitions debt. I mean, in the context of climate change, Just Energy Transition Partnership, or I call it JTP, aims to help finance Indonesia's energy transition. However, could you share your view on whether Indonesia's participation in the GTP is relevant and prudent from the debt management perspective? I mean, given that the JTP provides roughly about 19.4 billion USD in funding, while the countries, Indonesia, overall transitions need exceed that amount. I mean, thank you very much.
Test.
We can't hear you, Irma. Can you hear her, or is it only me?
Yeah, we cannot hear you, Irma. Irma, we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm
Yes.
sorry. Okay, we have another one participant who has raised his hand right now. For Pak Rahmat, please ask your question briefly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mbak Irma, and hello, Miss Mawish. Happy to see you again. I think this is the second time I see your presentations. The last time I think it's in the Directorate of General of Budget Financing and Risk Management last year. It's always astonishing what you shared to us. And my question is actually about the words you're using here is actually about the goals and the objectives. The objectives of Indonesia. I'm sorry. The objectives you mentioned that we have ambitious goals and objectives in the development and the growth. So, what is World Bank or your personally opinion about the 8% economic growth target? Do you think this is quite ambitious? And the second one is about the 3% rates for the debt.
You mentioned that we have to be flexible in terms of chasing the dynamics. Do you think we have to be more flexible even though there is no crisis like COVID? I mean, even today or the next year, we can improve or increase the debt rate above 3%, even though there is no crisis. Do you mean is it mean for flexibility? You mean or not? And the last question is about the rainy day funds or the contingency and the reserves. What do you think about today's Indonesian mechanisms and policy and rainy day funds or contingency? Do you think it's already tough enough to be sustained in the future or to face the very future or very dynamic world today? I think that's the question. Thank you.
Okay, probably we can we will be on two questions first, and with several layers of question from the second participant, I think that's good enough for now. Probably we can let Mavis to answer the question, please.
Yeah, no, sure. These are great questions, and I'm glad that you're thinking of it in multi kind of faceted perspective. So that's important. So to Johanna's question, I'm not an energy sector expert here, so I won't know a lot about GETP, but something that we have also looked at in different countries, including Indonesia, there is a World Bank report that goes by the name of Country Climate Development Report, Climate and Development Report, CCDR, that was, I think, published in 2023. Please do read that if you'd like to. And that's basically a core diagnostics that the bank does for most of the countries. And we have done one for Indonesia. And Indonesia was probably one of the first layers of CCDRs that we had done across the bank. In that analysis, and generally speaking, we understand that transition in the energy transition and these kinds of transition, they have a lot of risks and they have a lot of financing needs. And not all of those financing needs can be covered from public financing or even donor financing. So there is a need to crowd in private investment or private financing for these kinds of transitions. Now, in the context of adaptation, when you look at these concepts, adaptation is more of a public service. So you won't find a lot of private investors interested in doing adaptation investments. But when it comes to mitigation, such as the energy transition, there could be areas where private investment would be interested to come. For instance, in the renewable energy space, they would like to come and they would like to finance some of those transitions. So that's basically the whole idea. So you think about these kinds of envelopes as the most available from public financing, either from the government's own resources or from donors or multilaterals. But then there's a big financing need out there, which needs to be also looked at from a private investment, private financing perspective. And for that, it's important to think about some kind of enabling reforms, regulatory reforms that would allow those private investors or private financiers to come in and chip in their side of the pie. So that's how I would suggest Indonesia looks at it. And 19.4 billion USD, from the look of it, I can tell it's a very small part of the whole pie that needs to go in. But then also these are very long-term investments. So a lot of things need to happen on the way along, a lot of steps that needs to happen from the government. So the role probably from the government side is more of a facilitator, and then that could open up the financing from other interested partners, including private companies as well. So, and on the question from Rahmat, great questions and a lot of questions and important ones. So let me first try to talk about the flexibility and the contingency. I'll come to the growth towards the end. So when I was delivering the talk, I was mentioning and I was stressing on the point that it's important to think about this flexibility when the crisis hits. And so remember the analogy that I used of savings deposits? you kind of build them over time. You kind of build them during good times. You don't start building them when the crisis hits. You rely on them or you draw on them when the crisis hits. So flexibility is important, and it's important to be keep kept in mind when times are good, so that there is enough fiscal buffers, there is enough space to be utilized when the shocks really happen. The examples that I gave from Chile, the examples that I gave from Peru, those are examples in which these countries, which have, especially Chile, which has a slightly similar economic structure as Indonesia as a commodity exporter, they basically, and kind of also responding to your other question, they basically put together a reserve fund from those commodity windfalls during good times, and they put all the surplus money. They had a kind of a rule where revenues that exceed a certain amount of limit, they would consider those revenues from those commodities as surplus, and they will put them in the reserve fund. And that reserve fund would only be drawn upon in times of crisis with legislative support and with very clear escape clauses, with very clear reversal to the rule. So that's basically an idea. That's basically the idea of the whole discussion that I had. Flexibility is needed because you never know when the next crisis hits. So you have to have the space and you have to be ready to cover for that crisis. And when you look at Indonesia, you do see that the spending envelope is quite rigid in Indonesia. There are a lot of expenditures that are already pre-committed, like your salaries, for instance, the interest that you have to pay on your debt. So you don't have a lot of space to cover for that flexibility. And so it's important to think about what kind of efficiency gains you can achieve in your spending envelope, in your budget, so that you have much more flexibility, and how to then think about those funds if you want to think about those funds, and how to kind of operationalize those funds. Now, these concepts are as important as the governance arrangements around these things. So these concepts on paper or in terms of establishing a fund probably look very nice, but there is a whole lot that goes into the governance of these funds. What kind of rules define the kind of withdrawal or the disbursement into these funds? Who has the veto power? What kind of committees are kind of established to oversee these funds? And it's important for Indonesia to think about those funds as a commodity, as kind of a quasi commodity exporter also, and that could be a good way for Indonesia to ensure there is enough buffer for shocks in the future. But let me also commend Indonesia from what we have seen in COVID-19 pandemic. And as I mentioned, that's probably one of the good examples that we also keep giving to other countries when we talk about these concepts to them. That look how Indonesia had a very simple deficit rule, it had a very simple debt rule, but when the time came, because they have had the space, they relaxed that rule with proper legal support, and they had a very specific exit and re-entry kind of a timeline, and they committed to it, and they even delivered it a year earlier. So I think, if I remember correctly, at that time, Indonesia had mentioned that they will come back to their rule in 2023, but they in fact did it in 2022. So that speaks of the fiscal space, of the flexibility that you had already kind of built into your fiscal policy or into your fiscal accounts through all those good years of macroeconomic stability and fiscal stability. And that kind of also lent a lot of credibility to you, and the way all of this was communicated, all of this was done transparently, also didn't create any jitters within the markets, within your investors. They understood where you're coming from. They had seen you doing all the good work in the past, so they believed in you. And when you delivered on that, in case, God forbid, there is a shock of that nature next time, you would have a very good example from the past to kind of draw on, and investors would fully understand. But let me also reiterate, it's important to think about fiscal buffer and fiscal space, which is becoming a bit more narrow right now in Indonesia, given the 3% rule, and given how fiscal accounts are very going very close to that rule. So there's not a lot of savings that are being accumulated right now. So it's important to think about those aspects as you think about your growth objectives, as you think about your development objectives, and as you think about the next shocks or building resilience within your fiscal policy. Now, getting to your point on the 8% growth target. We have just published 3 weeks ago. There is a report. I would strongly encourage that you go and download that report and read it. I think I also reposted it on my LinkedIn, and so it would be important for you to go through it. At least if you can just read the first page, which is the key messages of that report, or if you have a little bit more time, just read the overview. It will give you the whole sense of what we think about the growth aspirations of Indonesia. It's basically a growth and jobs report on Indonesia, where we are giving you some numbers on what kind of growth trajectory Indonesia can pursue. But we actually basically benchmarked our analysis based on your golden view, the golden Indonesia view of 2045 high income. And I wouldn't go into details in terms of saying whether 8% or 6% or 7%. We have seen Indonesia staying at 5%, around 5% for a long time now. So I think it's important to think what different kind of policy mix is needed for Indonesia to go from the 5% to a 6 to 8% band. And how much of a macroeconomic stability or how much of a macroeconomic trade-off you can make while doing so. It's important to think about it both from the supply side as well as from the demand side. We have seen Indonesia right now going ahead with a lot of demand side policies. We've also seen Indonesia thinking about supply side. And when I say supply side in a very common way, what I'm trying to say is that the economic capacity of the country has to be enlarged in order to get from 5% to a 6% or a 7% or a 8%. And that will happen only with structural reforms, with the supply side reforms, with basically reforming your business environment a bit more, allowing more investment to come in, ensuring productivity happens within firms, within labor, and within the whole economy. So those kinds of things are very important. Opening up the economy and having more trade, and thinking about reducing the barriers to trade, the tariff barriers, the non-tariff barriers, and things like that. So those kinds of things are important for Indonesia to think through in terms of how to kind of pivot the policy mix, not just on the demand side, but also on the supply side, and in terms of improving or enhancing the capacity of the economy, so that you can jump from 5 to 6 or a band of 6 to 8%. But also important is the macroeconomic stability side of the story. You do not want to end up with a growth which will give you a lot of inflation. So it's important to think about those aspects, but we also feel, and there is some example and there is some lessons to be drawn from the 1998 Asian financial crisis, where Indonesia was booming before that, and then it kind of inherited some of the macroeconomic imbalances, but it was quick to recover, and we have seen that now for the past 3 decades. But this time, as I started one of the response, we see Indonesia at a very strong position. Indonesia's macroeconomic buffers are very good. Your debt to GDP level is still very, very moderate. Not to say that you go out tomorrow and start borrowing, but it's still very moderate compared to many other countries. And you have very good exchange rate buffers, exchange rate policies, you have foreign exchange buffers. And so this is a very good position for Indonesia to even withstand a little bit of the macroeconomic trade-offs, which comes with pursuing a high growth objective. But it's important to keep those trade-offs in consideration as Indonesia is moving ahead with its growth goals. Let me stop here and happy to answer more questions or if there are any follow-up questions.
Thank you so much, Mavis. From your response, you said that we have a strong position, but it still feels like we have lots of homeworks to do. We have other participants who asked from chat Zoom and live YouTube. Is it possible to ask 2 more questions, please?
Sure, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Let me read the questions from Zoom first. From Ibu Nurul Ardaninggar, based on cross-country evidence, which generates more sustainable revenue gains for emerging economies like Indonesia, raising tax rates or broadening the tax base through stronger compliance and administrative reform, and why? Okay, probably we have that tax harmonization law that we have raised our tax rates like value-added tax and everything, probably regarding that one. And the other one is question from YouTube, Mako Fever. I think this one is our regular. Are economic recovery after shock expected? Does all country eventually recover reliably from shocks? Are these countries that fails to recover timely? What lesson should we learn from them? Okay. I will let you answer those questions, please.
Thank you, Irma, for reading those questions out for me. And these are, I'm glad that we are finishing the session in shortly because the questions are becoming difficult now. I know, but let me try to attempt these two questions. First on the tax. So I wouldn't say it's one or the other. It has to happen on all fronts. But as I mentioned in some of the examples, some of the peer examples that we have seen, a very close example is Vietnam. They have done a lot of revenue. They have gotten and generated a lot of revenues using base broadening as their main policy tool on taxation. And then we have also seen Mexico's example, which is primarily focusing on digitization. Another example that comes to mind is South Africa, that have done a lot on digitization, and that has improved taxpayer perception, and that in turn has improved the domestic revenue mobilization. So there are there has to be a good policy mix on taxes for Indonesia, and we feel that it's important to think about administrative reforms, compliance reforms, ensuring enforcement, base broadening. Tax rates, we've seen some hikes in the past, and we understand that there are some hikes also mandated by the tax harmonization law, which Irma was kindly referring to. But we also believe that it's important to do all of these things hand in hand, and maybe a sequence would be a better way to do. And we would suggest from our side that it's important to think about compliance, enforcement, base broadening first before going for policy rate hike. As I also mentioned in my talk earlier, rate hikes or frequent rate hikes are a bit more distortive and disruptive to the economy in general, and also from a fairness perspective. Whereas compliance and enforcement are much more of a kind of a tool that can go on in parallel and that can generate small results along the way at the beginning, but then when you kind of snowball all of these, it becomes a major kind of achievement over time. And these things take time, and these actions and these tools are much more medium to long term in nature. Policy rate hikes and these things are a little short term in nature, so you receive or you gain revenues almost immediately with these policy rate changes, but much less so with administration and compliance. So it's largely a policy mix that needs to be designed in a way that speaks to the country's context for Indonesia, and how policymakers are approaching right now. We feel they are looking at the compliance, which is the right way to do, and they're looking at enforcement, and they're looking at base broadening. So we agree with that, and we appreciate that Indonesia is moving ahead on those arenas. So that's the response for the text question. On the recovery, it's a very good question. So the examples that I showed and the examples that I talked about were all successful examples. And so you're basically giving me a sense that I should also start talking about bad examples next time. I haven't. There are not many examples, to be honest, which have gone through shocks and haven't recovered. But one that comes off the top of my mind to my mind is Lebanon. So they went through a shock, but they haven't. They didn't recover, or they took a lot of time to recover, and they're still going through the after effects of the shock. And the economy hasn't stabilized. So that is one example that I can think of. But those examples also kind of uh, reinforce the points that I made in my talk earlier, having good stable environment before the shock, having the fiscal buffers, thinking about the all your frameworks, not just fiscal policy, but also how fiscal policy is speaking to your monetary policy and your financial sector policy. So how well they are coordinated, how well they're synchronized. All of these things matter in terms of responding to shocks. Because we were talking about fiscal policy and fiscal sustainability in this session, I focused primarily on fiscal sustainability, but there are a number of macroeconomic policies that need to talk and speak to each other and be consistent. And of course, there has to be buffers, not just on the fiscal side, but also on the monetary side. In order for for economies to sustain those shocks and to recover well after the shocks, we saw Indonesia recovering quite well after pandemic shock. We've seen other countries also recovering quite well. As long as you're starting from a strong level of macroeconomic stability from before crisis or before shock, it's very, very possible, unless you really do the things the wrong way, that you will recover almost instantly and quickly. But if there are already macroeconomic imbalances and they are growing and they are large pre-crisis, then they even become much more difficult to manage post-crisis. Let me stop here.
Okay, thank you, Mawis, for your responses. Uh, we still got lots of questions, but I believe that we already in our end of the session. I think our participants found your presentation is very fascinating. So thank you so much. Okay, because of the time limit, I'd like to close the Q&A session. I'm so sorry for all. Apologize for those who are not able to deliver their questions. We really appreciate it all. Thank you all participants for all the great questions and discussion with Mawis. All right, Mawis, would you like to give a closing statement to conclude our session?
Thank you so much, Irma. Thank you, colleagues, for joining today, and thank you for having me here. Terima kasih. Really appreciate the questions, and I'm glad that there's a lot of interest in this area, and there are a lot of intellectual discussions that can happen on the side. I'd be happy to take some of the questions offline, especially from our counterparts in the government, and I'm happy to, because I'm based in Jakarta, so I'm happy to keep seeing you here and there, meeting in person. Happy to come and talk about things that you would like us to talk and work and help you on that front. I just wanted to kind of conclude by saying that please do not get fixated by these concepts. These concepts are very, very, very easy to understand if you try to apply these concepts on your day-to-day life in your own respective sense, and think about those concepts from that perspective. The example that I gave of student loans, for instance, or mortgages, these are very real life examples. So think about these concepts from that perspective. That helps you kind of understand the basics behind these concepts, and then you also think about these concepts from a broader population perspective, from your fellow citizens perspective, and also thinking about it from an investor and market perspective. So those kinds of aspects is something that I would like you to draw home and take away from this session. And really, Indonesia is, as I mentioned, is at a very strong position, but it's also at a very pivotal point in its history. There are ambitious goals for Indonesia, development goals and high growth ambitions, and fiscal policy has a role to play, even though we feel that the structural reforms and the supply side policies have a bigger role to play. So it has all it has to all come together in order for Indonesia to really navigate the next kind of goalpost in its development trajectory of being a high income country, and make sure that all of this is done coordinated and in an integrated way, as was the case in the past 3 or 4 decades that we have seen in Indonesia. Thank you once again for having me here. Assalamu alaikum.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much for the very insightful session with us. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big hand and applause to Mewis Ashraf. Thank you once again for making the time with us. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a fruitful discussion today, and now we come to the end of the Kemenkeu Learning Week Day 2. To all participants who joined us today, we would like to say thank you for your participation. Please do join KLC, the join code. This one is everyone's been waiting for. 022026. I'll repeat them. 022026. And fill in the feedback form available in the course to get a certificate. Have a great day, everyone. See you tomorrow on Ministry of Finance Learning Week Day 3 with the theme Improving Integrity and Good Governance, How Geography Matters with Mr. Grant Welton, Associate Professor at Crawford School of Public Policy, Australian National University. I'm Irma. Good day and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.